All right, our final book of the New Testament. We are wrapping up our study, the book of Revelation. It's the last, but also by almost any regard, the most challenging of the entire New Testament. Might be one of the reasons why it was put last. It's one of the most interesting and often argued over pieces of writing in world history, especially among the Christians. Opinions massively vary as to its specific meaning. Church history has shown it to be a highly contentious work among believers, how to interpret it. People often respond to Revelation different ways. Some choose to outright avoid this book with its odd images and confusing structure and what in the world is going on. Others get very detailed and try to pick it apart. So, for us and our goal in this, following this whole class, it's not going to be to interpret every element. We don't have, that would be a whole class in itself, even if we could with certainty, which part of me kind of questions is even possible. Rather, I just want to give you an overall understanding of this book, where it fits, what the big ideas are as you read through it, kind of what to have in mind, and to know what the author is trying to communicate. I believe that that's the best way to approach Revelation. Just get the big idea. Just here's what's going on. Here's why it was written. Here's what it's trying to communicate. And I think you can let the details kind of go by the wayside because some of them, oftentimes, let's just be honest, are over our head a little bit. And that's okay. That's okay. You'll kind of see what I mean by that. So we'll start with some background because background is super important for the book of Revelation. The author was a man named John, and there's a lot of weight to the commonly held belief that this was the same John who wrote other books. John the Seer is probably John the Apostle, and he was most likely the disciple of Jesus. He wrote this letter near the end of his life, so we're in the 90s, so some 60 some years after Jesus. John is an old man. He was a young teenager when he met Jesus. Now he's old, and he has been exiled on an island called Patmos. Now, exile was a punishment that was given to someone who did something that was bad but didn't quite warrant death, or more likely in this case, the government didn't want to make them a martyr because maybe they were killing all these Christians, and every time they killed Christians, there just more Christians showed up because the early church fathers once said, the blood of the martyrs is seeds of the church growing. So it's possible that they didn't want to kill John because they would just make him a hero. So they just tried to exile him and get rid of him. So he writes a letter from exile back to the churches in Asia Minor. So it's addressed to a number of them. This was a letter that was to be expected to pass to all of them. He has a little word for a bunch of different ones, and they were really facing some difficulty. Now, you've been following me throughout the New Testament, and you've heard me already quite a few times talk about difficulty and persecution. Just in a few books earlier, we looked at Peter, who was very much like, it's tough, it's hard. We saw Paul being in prison in Philippians, in the book of Mark, probably written in the 60s to persecuted Christians. It was rough. It got worse. And so if you study church history, you realize there's a period in the 60s that were pretty bad, but then in the 90s and the turn of the century, it really got difficult. And one of the main things that got so difficult, starting with an emperor named Domitian. Domitian, we know a little bit, seemed maybe a little crazy. We're not sure. Bit of a tyrannical ruler. Domitian got it in his head that, and this is a whole bigger thing, but previous emperors had referred to themselves as sons of God. And when they said that, they were probably referring more to stuff about being the image bearer of the gods, being the anointed one to rule. Domitian really took it to heart and saw himself as being divine and that he should be worshiped. And he expected all of his citizens to comply. And so you almost have a picture of the book of Daniel here when everyone's forced to bow down to the golden image. You're sort of seeing that again play out on world history. And what this became known as was called the cult of emperor worship, whereby along with all the other gods, you had temples to Zeus and Aphrodite and all of them. Now you added the emperor to your list of people and gods and deities that you would give your worship and honor to. And what's important to understand is many Roman colonies were more than happy to comply because for them, they want the emperor to like them and do good for them and give ease on taxes and build them new roads and things. They were all vying for more favor from the emperor at all times, constantly, therefore, wanting to increase their show of support and love. We love the emperor, we'll worship him, we'll bow down to him, and then he'll take care of our city. Not everyone, he's eventually assassinated, but that's the point. But obviously, this is a big issue for Christians who rightly refuse to worship anyone other than the one true God as revealed in Jesus. So they were like, no, we're not going to worship an emperor. We're not worshiping Zeus, Aphrodite, or the emperor. Well, this refusal created two problems. First, it put him in the crosshairs of the Roman emperor himself. How dare you not worship me, right? But also the colonies and all these different cities, Laodicea, Philippi, Colossae, all these places that we've seen letters written to, the leaders of all of those cities would have been upset that people within their city weren't worshiping the emperor and showing him favor, because that would come back and hurt them in their city, because they want the emperor to be happy with them. So Christians were getting it from two fronts. And eventually by the 90s and the turn of the century, you had full-blown persecution. I mean, just people being thrown to lions and murdered in the street. It got really ugly. So here's John's reason for writing this letter. John not only saw that persecution was getting bad, but he actually had a vision that it was going to get worse, and it did. And actually the worst persecution ever would come almost 2 centuries later. The church was about to get hit with heavy persecution, and this was only going to intensify. And he was right. And so he writes this vision, this letter, and asks it to be passed around to different churches, challenging them to stay faithful, giving them like some warnings, some like, hey, get ready for this, giving them a bigger picture to see beyond it, and just like, hey, this is coming, get ready. But as it's coming, let me give you a bigger picture of reality. And John himself is imprisoned, right? So John, he knows what it's like to be persecuted. Others are beginning to suffer, even die. And there's an eventual Holocaust coming against Christians, but John is speaking prophetically to them that they got to get ready, get their houses, their churches in order, and stand strong against what is coming. So that's the cultural context of this book. Now, when you hear that, it can change how some people use Revelation. Is this all about the future? We're going to get that a little bit. There could be some of that, but at its core, John is writing to real people at a real time in history where things were looking really difficult. And his theme, his big idea, is that God will ultimately be victorious. The bigger picture that John wants to tell them is like, hey, difficulty's coming, but God is going to win. And if you're on God's side, it's going to turn out well for you. He paints a picture of what's essentially a holy war Christians are engaged in, but not literally killing each other physically, but persecution and a war spiritually, of a battle for you to give up and surrender and crush this church and be done with it on the earth, rather than standing strong and firm through it. And he kind of paints this whole picture all the way back to Genesis and the Satan and the war against God's people, ultimately coming to this massive cosmic conclusion. So there's a lot here. And John speaks of God as a warrior, of overcoming threats to his people. And throughout history, people have really, does this mean that Christians should be warriors engaging in violence? Probably not the class for that, but it's a good question. But really, I think what John is doing is painting a picture of an image of God being on our side and fighting for us, and that he will triumph in the end. So the role of God's people is not to pick up swords and kill Romans, but it's to stand strong through the persecution, trusting that it'll be worth it, even if we die in this life. That's really what's going on. So for John, it's not about fear. The book of Revelation was not written to scare everyone. Be like, oh no, run for your life. It was encouragement. It's like, hey, this is coming, but you can stand through it. And here's why. There's great hope amidst the dark and the gloom and all this stuff that's going to come your way. Christ is Lord, and all those who suffer with him will be glorified with him. Because in the end, God is going to win. Giving up and surrendering to all of this puts you on the losing side. Being willing to die for this and have your blood spill is actually joining the winning team. So no matter how bleak it might seem, keep your eyes on the future, keep your eyes on God, and stand strong. Which again, you might be like, okay, man, we've gone through the whole New Testament, and it seems like a lot of these books are about staying in persecution. Yeah, because that was the world they lived in. That was their life. And sometimes as 21st century Americans, we can struggle reading these texts because our lives are pretty easy. We don't face a lot of persecution and struggle. We're not like, oh, I'm going to stand strong or I'm going to die tomorrow. Thankfully, I'm glad we don't. But we got to be careful that we're not perverting these texts to mean something we want them to mean because we don't understand what they meant to those people. So and that's really kind of a big theme or big idea of this book. Revelation is unique, not because it's telling us something that the other Paul, Peter, James, Jude have told us about standing persecution. Revelation is unique, not because what it wants to communicate, but how it wants to communicate. Revelation stands apart from those other books because it's just so different. There's a great scholar, Gordon Fee, who I love, a New Testament scholar. And I'll just read this quote. Gordon Fee says this about the book of Revelation. He says, "It's like stepping into a bizarre new world like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. Dragons, bottomless pits, earthquakes, disasters, written in strange, cryptic language. It tends to lead us to one of two extremes. Some people, maybe wisely, choose to avoid it altogether." I don't even read that book. Others take sort of an exaggerated interest, thinking they'll find every little key to understand the end of the world. And for Fee, like both of those can be a bit problematic, and I agree with him. For most people, the biggest problem with Revelation is simply not understanding how to read it. What am I approaching when I open this book? We know what a letter is. We know what an argument is. We can read John, he's writing a letter. We can read Mark and be like, oh, he's telling a story. There's history here. We have rudimentary understandings of poetry when I read the Psalms or wisdom literature I've talked about. But Revelation, it's something completely different. It's a genre of literature known as apocalyptic. And people often refer to apocalypse as like the end of the world. That's not what the word means. Apocalypto means a mystery, something hidden. Apocalyptic literature is very common in the ancient world, especially in the centuries leading up to Jesus and a few centuries after. So right when this was written, other Jewish people were writing apocalyptic literature. So here's what this mystery literature is. Apocalyptic is a style of writing that uses heavy symbolic language to speak of things, often things they couldn't say openly. As it usually involved, God acting against foreign oppressors, like Rome in this case. So a lot of apocalyptic literature be like, well, if you wrote a letter saying God was going to destroy the emperor and Rome was going to collapse, and Rome found that letter, well, you're in a lot of trouble. So instead, you might write, the great whore of Babylon will be struck down and the sun will turn black and the moon to blood. You're using imagery to say something you can't really say out loud. And so you often communicated in visions and dreams and like fantasy based pictures and ideas of dragons and beasts and a woman clothed with the sun. They're all based on a style that really goes back to Daniel's when we first start seeing it. Cryptic, symbolic, numbers, dividing things into specific packages to communicate ideas. So that means, though, that they're not just random pictures, but actually symbols that had meaning to people in that day. And I want you to understand what I just said. The symbols had meaning to the people. So I've heard someone say, well, if you in Revelation, he like sees things that look like locust. I wonder if he had a vision of helicopters, dropping bombs, but he didn't know how to describe it. I don't think so. I think Paul chose imagery that spoke in a way that his audience understood and he understood for his time. So let me offer you some tips to reading this book. And some of the tips I'm going to give you might kind of tip my hand towards how I read it, but I think they're important and good no matter how you approach it theologically. The first is this. It's good biblical exegesis, studying the Bible, pulling things out of the Bible rather than reading things into the Bible, to assume that the author knows what they're saying and that John understood the words that he was using. What I mean by that is it wasn't like John went into some trance and his hand just started magically moving and he wrote down like, what is this? I don't understand any of this. Well, here you go, guys. That's not a good way to read the Bible. The best way to read it is to assume that the author, in this case, John, knew exactly what he was writing down. And therefore his original intent, what he wanted to write down, what he was thinking in his head is what this means. Well, John didn't even understand it. He just wrote it down, hoping that future generations, thousands of years later, would unpack it. I don't think that's a good reading of the Bible. I think John understood that he was writing words that had meaning because, again, what's he doing? He's writing encouragement and a warning to fellow Christians of his day. Why would he send them a letter that he didn't know what it meant? Why would any of the early Christians been like, oh, thanks, John? what is this? Weird dragons? What are you talking about? No, they would have understood it. He understood it and they understood it. And that's why it was encouraging. It would not have been encouraging if no one understood it. Okay. All right. Second, this means that all of his fantastical images represent a reality. They represent something real and are the key to interpreting it. For example, beasts coming out of the sea and land most likely represent empires. We see that kind of in other places like Daniel and others. Earthquakes and sky falling, blood moons are often divine judgment, God toppling things down. Like John's contemporaries, that's how they often use those phrases. We have other apocalyptic books that use a lot of the same phrases that John does. Some analogies John appears to pull from the Old Testament directly. One like the Son of Man is pulled right from Daniel. We also see, going back, if you watch the video about Jude before this, he uses books like First Enoch and others that were also very apocalyptic in nature. And then some he just has himself and he defines them: stars, lampstands, things like that. And he says, the stars are this, the lampstand. So he even kind of tells us what he's referring to. And then other things in Revelation appear to be kind of thinly veiled allusions to stuff in his world. A 7-headed, dragon, probably, Rome was built on 7 hills. I mean, so if you were living in the first century, like, oh, the 7-headed dragon. Gotcha, John. I know who you're talking about. The number 666 and the mark of the beast. This is speculation, but a lot of people believe that the cult of emperor worship required you to burn incense and put ash on you to show that you worshipped. So taking, they called the emperor Domitian the beast. So there seems to be allusions to stuff going on in their world. And then there's other things that you're like, I'm not quite sure what he means there, which, that's probably a lot of it. I'm not sure what he means there. But at least you understand that when you open this book, you're diving into a different world, a different time, and people using language and imagery that doesn't make sense to you. Let me give you a quick example and I'm going to move on. Sometimes when I talk about Revelation, I show a picture, and I don't have it with me for this video, I apologize, but there was a Time magazine cover of a cartoon drawing of a huge cartoon elephant stomping on the head of a donkey. And that's all it was. And I remember using it once I showed a class and I said, what is this? What's happening? And everyone in the room knew exactly what was happening. They were all Americans and they were all college students. And they all had, oh, well, Republicans are elephants and Democrats are donkeys. It probably means the Republicans won an election. Exactly. That was the week after a midterm primary when the Republicans overtook the House or something like that. There's something similar about Revelation. Imagery and pictures that sometimes are lost to us, because if you showed that same picture to someone in Ethiopia, they'd be like, why there's a cartoon elephant? I have no idea, because they don't understand the analogies. But we do. And in the case of Revelation, we don't always. It can be difficult. So a third thing then, Revelation is also deeply tied to the overall story. You can't read and understand it without a grasp of the whole story of God. There's 250 references to the Old Testament, church, Israel, Jesus, the Passover lamb, Rome, and Babylon, all these kind of things. Babylon is all over. Who's Babylon? Well, you need to know Daniel in the Old Testament to make sense of that. And then finally, in kind of getting to what we already talked about, there's a lot of disagreement over when John sees all of this happening. Some argue it was only for his day. We call this the preterist view, meaning he was just writing to the first century church. Others say he was sort of speaking about the general life of the whole church for thousands of years, like a historical perspective of what the church would deal with. Preterist and historical have some relationships. Others take the opposite route and argue that it's all just a general analogy of spiritual warfare, and there's no actual tie to real history or anything. It's all just John looking up into the heavens. We call that the idealist view, probably the least popular. And of course, especially in America and the West, one of the most common ways is the futurist view, which believes that John actually has a picture of what we call the end times and the second coming and return of Christ. So which one is it? Probably a mixture. I think that's something that each of you should consider on your own. You can figure it out. Maybe that's in our class or sometime, but I'll leave that to you. I definitely believe that there was a lot of historical preterist side to it, of John writing to real people about real things that actually ended up happening. I would say there definitely could be futuristic sides to it. But one thing I want to consider with you before we do a quick walkthrough, Again, going back to persecution, people living in persecution always read Revelation very differently than people that don't. So people who have their Bibles open in Burma, where Christians are hiding in caves, read Revelation as this is a message to stay strong through persecution. People that live in the West, and the most persecution we face is, someone cut us off in traffic or something. Um, we tend to make up other things that this might mean, but there could be both sides to it. All right, let's do a quick walkthrough. There's so much dense stuff to walk through in Revelation. It can be hard to even, how much do we get into this? The first 3 chapters are a message to the churches. He receives a revelation about what's to take place. The risen Christ holds all things. He's triumphed through death. And he wants to give a special message to each church about being faithful. And he addresses each one individually and tells them things that are going well and things that aren't going well. You might think of it this way, almost like imagine you're an army commander, and that there's the enemy soldiers are on the march, and in a few days they're going to be here, and it's going to be all out war. And you go to each of the platoons, you say, all right, the enemy's coming. Hey, your ditches aren't dig enough, clean that up. Oh, hey, your stuff's dirty, get that ready. Hey, you don't have enough ammunition, right? You're getting everybody ready for what's coming. That appears what he's doing. Hey, I have this against you. You need to change this, or you're not going to survive the coming persecution. Hey, you're doing good here, but when the persecution comes, this is going to mess you up if you don't address it now. That's kind of what the beginning of the book does. And in many ways, the beginning of Revelation is probably the most applicable, because you can read those letters, those churches, and really say, how do these apply to our lives today? Which of these churches, the message of these churches should I really might be speaking to me? Like, has my love grown cold? Am I lukewarm? All these kind of things. Have I allowed too much sin in my life? Great messages for the whole world. Then in chapter 4, things get fun. However, and I think he does this on purpose, before John really gets into the difficulty, the bad stuff, chapter 4 is a vision of God's throne room. And historically speaking, there's not proof of this, but there's a lot of good evidence that this glimpse of the heavenly throne room, the creator, the sustainer of all things, people singing his praises, the glass sea, all this kind of stuff, the slain lamb next to him, triumphing over death, judging the world. There's a lot of imagery in this that historians tell us looks kind of similar to Domitian's throne room, and when he would parade through cities. But this is so much bigger and more glorious. If that's not true, that's okay. But if it is true, it kind of gives us a picture of what John is doing here. He's saying, hey, the guy that's persecuting you is pretending he's regal and powerful. Let me tell you about the real regal and powerful one. This guy's a pretender. The real king is on the real throne, and it's much bigger and more glorious than anything this guy can do. And he starts with a picture of the one true king, the real God that we're to focus on and keep at the forefront of our mind. So when the imposter shows up and says, bow down and worship me, we say, you're not the real God. You're a puny imitation of the real one. I've got a picture of the real God, and you're not it, so I'm not going to worship you. Setting the stage for the hardship. Starting in chapter 5 through chapter 11, there's this long section of strange, difficult to follow. It can be tough. 7 scrolls opened by Christ, releasing horsemen, evil on the earth, earthquakes, judgment, a pause, the sealing of the Spirit. Then the 7th seal is open. All hell breaks loose. Angels wreak havoc on God's enemies. It's trumpets blast, calamity. A couple interludes, and now John is hearing God call the church to be a witness to the world, even if it means death, ending with a trumpet announcing the ultimate final victory, rewarding those who've been faithful. Ooh, yeah. How much of that is John saying a bunch of bad stuff's going to happen, and how much of it is John saying, hey, bad stuff's going to happen to them eventually? It could go either way. Chapter 12 through 14, there's a war between church and evil. I think John is kind of seeing the same thing, but from a different perspective. He's kind of like, let me show it this way. That's kind of that one way, now it's this way. 12 through 14 seems more like it's the battle that we're currently fighting, whereas the chapters before seem like what's going to happen eventually. He speaks of the ultimate end of all those who oppose Christ, 2 competing brides and 2 competing cities. You've got whore and Babylon, the church and the bride. The dragon is making war on the woman, the church, since the beginning, but the church overcomes, and Satan wages war through his beast. Could that be Rome, general evil culture? I don't know. the mark of the beast, false prophets. But John speaks of the end, and those being glorified who stand strong. You get to chapters 15 and 16, these bowls of judgment coming on those who have persecuted the church. And then in chapter 17, you have God's ultimate victory. Again, you have the two women, the two cities, the whore of Babylon and the harlot and the bride of Christ. You have judgment against Babylon, Rome, whoever, and complete restoration of the world as God intended it. The harlot's thrown down, sin and death are judged, a great war is fought, Christ destroys the enemies, Satan himself, even death is thrown into a lake of fire. And Revelation ends with a picture of all creation restored and made new again. And there's a tree of life in the center of a city, just like there was a tree of life in the center of a garden in the beginning. The whole thing comes full circle. So the big idea, really, here at the end of Revelation, as well as New Testament, is the story has been completed. The overall theme of Revelation is this holy war and God's victory. The holy war started the minute Adam and Eve made a decision, but it's fully completed now. And the thing that we've been waiting for, of redeemed and restored earth, of bringing things back to what they were originally created to be, has happened. We've had creation, then fall, but now redemption and full restoration. And the book of Revelation looks ahead to show us the end is going to be glorious. So don't give up. And so when you step back and look at it from the perspective, you can see what John is doing. He wants you to see, hey, there's a bigger picture than the pain you're dealing with right now. Let me turn your eyes to the real throne room, the real God, not the imitation. Let me turn your eyes to where the war is actually what you might look. It might look in your head like you're losing the war, like things aren't going well. But take a look up in heaven, you'll realize we're conquering. And in the end, it's all going to be worth it. And this is all going to come down to God being victorious. So don't give up. Don't give in. Keep fighting. Keep holding strong to the end, which is so much of the letters. So that is the book of Revelation, and that is a survey of the New Testament. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining with me on this. Hopefully it was helpful and you really gained a greater appreciation for the scriptures. I know I have, just even working through this and making these videos with you guys. So thanks so much. And man, keep reading, keep diving in. And hope that this has caused you to fall in love with the Bible as much as it has me. Thanks, everybody.